this inequality? How are we going to address this injustice? Guyana's position is that there must be an immediate re-examination of the financing gap and the debt portfolio of the developing countries to open fiscal space and create an opportunity for recovery, bridging the gap and attaining the SDG goals. Guyana welcomes the global initiatives around pandemic preparedness. It is imperative that we collectively discuss how to address any potential pandemic and health threats so that we are better equipped in the future to avoid the inequalities that exist. Mr. President, Excellencies, the global food security problem has disproportionately affected us. The prevalence of moderate and severe food insecurity trended upwards since 2014, with estimated increase in 2020 equaling that of the previous 5 years combined. In 2020, 2.37 billion of the world's population were food insecure. Additionally, the World Food Programme and FAO warned that acute food insecurity would worsen in 20 hunger hotspots from June to September 2022. Since the start of the pandemic, global food prices have surged by 65% and are expected to remain high in the medium term as a result of supply chain constraints, a hike in energy costs, higher shipping costs, climate issues, the war in Ukraine, and the fertilizer crisis. Further, since the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war, global food prices increased sharply, reaching an all-time high in February 2022. The FAO projects that the production of cereals, a crop relied on the most in the world, would decline by 40 million tons, or 1.4% when compared to the preceding year. The global food import bill trajectory is a whopping 1.8 trillion this year, a record high. The global food import bill is projected to rise by 51 billion from 2021, 49 billion of which reflects higher prices. The question is, what are we going to do about this? Can the reversal of export bans on rice and wheat and freeing up of grains help the situation? The answer is a resounding yes. For example, export bans of rice from India and wheat from Russia contributed to a price increase of 12.3% and 9% for rice and wheat respectively. As world leaders, we must find the balance now. In honoring our commitment to promote peace, stability, respect for territorial integrity and democracy, and the human rights for all, we must work collectively to prevent situations that can widen inequality and create social and economic havoc. Now is the time for us to decide if a new approach is needed to guarantee food security, energy security, climate security, access to health care and quality education, and security from conflicts and wars. According to the World Bank and Global Trade, between January to February 2022, 135 policy measures were announced or implemented that affected trade in food and fertilizer. During the same period, 34 nations imposed restrictive export measures on food and fertilizers. The questions therefore are whether globalization is only applicable under normal conditions, or whether it is opportunistic and in its application, and when a crisis arises, we lock ourselves in and forget about multilateralism and globalization. The evidence is glaring: COVID-19 vaccination and now access to food and fertilizer. A welcome initiative is the FAO's Global Food Import Financing Facility, which seeks to respond to the prevailing soaring food import costs and addressing the needs of the most exposed. However, there is need to revise the eligibility criteria to accommodate countries beyond the categories of low-income and low-middle-income groups. This narrow grouping heightens the chance that many at-risk, economically vulnerable countries, such as the Caribbean, with large food and food import needs, will be excluded. Mr. President, Excellencies, we all recognize that there is a climate crisis. We must go back to some of the decisions. For example, in COP26, we agreed no more coal-fired power projects. What is the reality? While policies and planning for climate change adaptation are expanding, according to the Adaptation Gap Report 2021, the Gathering Storm, financing and implementation are still far behind. Financing of adaptation and implementation are still far behind where they should be. The analysis shows the costs of adaptation are most likely to be higher than the predicted range of US 140 to 300 billion annually by 2030, and US dollars 280 to 500 billion annually by 2050 for developing nations. In 2019, US dollars 79.6 billion was allocated to developing nations for planning and carrying out mitigation and adaptation measures. The gap between predicted adaptation costs and existing public adaptation financial flows is generally growing and ranges from 5 to 10 times more. The paltry 100 billion pledge and the failure to meet it must be viewed as adaptation and addressing loss and damage. It is not enough. The adoption of broad rules on carbon markets in Glasgow has the potential to unlock critical resources for forest-rich countries. Forested countries like Guyana can potentially earn billions of dollars accessible through the voluntary carbon markets. However, the current approximate price is US $10 per ton on the voluntary market, whilst according to an IMF report, the price should be closer to $70 US per ton. COP27 must make progress in refining the rules for the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and make decisions that would increase the price of carbon traded in voluntary carbon markets. Mr. President, Excellencies, the world is also faced with an energy crisis. In 2019, almost 10% of the world's population did not have access to electricity. Electricity generated by fossil fuel increased by 178% from 2000 and 2021. Electricity generated from coal increased by 173% from 2000. Based on a recent energy outlook from the US Energy Information Administration, coal-fired generation is expected to be a key energy component as a result of several factors, including a drop in the share of natural gas and rising oil prices. Whilst all of this is occurring, the global energy demand is projected to increase by 47% in the next 30 years. According to the IEA, global electricity demand grew by 6% in 2021 and is projected to grow by 2.4% in 2022, of which only 50% is expected to be met from renewables. As such, the other 50% would have to be met from non-renewable energy sources. Furthermore, analysis by the IEA indicates that getting on the path to net zero emissions by 2050 would require a threefold increase in the current level of investments in the clean energy transition to about $4 trillion by 2030. The question is, therefore, how do we realistically strike this balance? This conversation must be practical, comprehensive, and fact-based. We all recognize that adjustments must be made to save our planet. But how will we craft this adjustment, considering the energy and food crisis, which are also critical, and ensure that inequality and access do not widen? In this energy transition, fossil fuel remains necessary. In this context, we are convinced that new entrants like Guyana must be part of this balanced approach. Even as a new entrant, Guyana proposed at COP26 the removal of subsidies from fossil fuel production and advocated the need for a strong global carbon price. We, however, do not believe that new entrants should be punished by removing access to financing and increasing costs of financing. This, in effect, will protect an existing monopoly, drive up the cost of investment, and deliver a higher price product. Mr. President, Excellencies, we are committed to building a Guyana that addresses issues of food security, climate change, energy security, and inequalities within our country and the region. Under the banner of One Guyana, my government has embarked on many initiatives to help bridge the gaps of inequality and access. We are on a path to reduce Guyana's food import bill and increase food security through increased cultivation and investment in new technology, climate-smart agriculture, all aimed at positioning Guyana as a leading food producer in CARICOM. Providing incentives, capital, land, and opportunities for youth and women to participate in agricultural transformation. To this end, we've earmarked 35% of all new agro-businesses to be led by women and have increased youth participation in agriculture with the use of technology by more than 40%. We are pursuing a low-carbon development strategy which aims at creating a model for value ecosystem services and sustainably developing and managing the blue economy, investing in clean energy and stimulate low-carbon growth, protecting against climate change and biodiversity loss, alignment with global climate and biodiversity goals. Our forests, which is the size of England, stored 19.5 gigatons of carbon with a deforestation rate of less than 0.05%. We intend to continue the sustainable management of our forests as a key national and global good. Having already achieved net zero, we are working steadfastly in our transition from a 2020 status of 95% dependence on heavy fuel oil and diesel to an energy mix which includes hydropower, solar, wind, and natural gas, from which more than 500 megawatts of new generating capacity will come on stream, of which 87% of this generated energy will be from clean and renewable sources. Human resource transformation through education is a key driver of our development. The achievement of inclusive and equitable quality education and promotion of lifelong learning opportunities are all inextricably linked to attaining our sustainable development goals, including full employment, poverty eradication, and gender equality. Access to free, quality primary and secondary education will soon be followed by free tertiary education. The government of Guyana has invested in our indigenous communities in infrastructure, education, training, healthcare, and installing internet access capabilities. And we have commenced the training of our workforce for 2030 and beyond. Soon, we will be offering coding skills at our primary school, primary and secondary levels. Mr. President, Excellencies, gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in all spheres of life, of national life, is a priority. We are committed to ensuring equal access to education for girls and boys. Indeed, more girls are attending school in Guyana and graduating from university. Our focus now includes ensuring that our boys are not left behind. We have initiated several programs to create earning and employment opportunities for women and promote their financial independence. Recognizing that empowerment is inextricably linked to addressing the root causes of and eradicating discrimination and gender-based violence. To achieve balanced growth and sustainable and resilient development for Guyana, our strategies must focus on developing a diversified economic base, strengthen our agricultural and food production system, human resource transformation, investing in the social sector to deliver world-class health, education, and housing for all our people, ensuring an inclusive and equitable society in which prosperity is enjoyed by all, building our future through the strengthening of our democratic values and respect for the rule of law. Mr. President, Excellencies, as part of the global family, Guyana subscribes to a rule-based international order, as well as the need for resurgence of political will and commitment to protect the multilateral architecture. We are deeply concerned about the number of persons living in conflict situations. The ongoing war in Ukraine is having terrible effects on the region and country, the impact of which are disproportionately felt by women and children. We urge a speedy and peaceful resolution of the conflict and express support for the efforts of the United Nations Secretary General in this regard. In our own region, we again join the overwhelming majority of members of the international community in reiterating Guyana's rejection of the sanctions imposed on the Republic of Cuba. Guyana also restates its solidarity with the Palestinian people and its support for their dignified existence in their own homeland in accordance with a two-state solution. Guyana does not condone or support the threat of or use of force in relations between states or in the resolution of disputes. Consistent with the Charter of the United Nations, Guyana subscribes to the use of peaceful means to settle disputes. In this context, Guyana thanks those who have already expressed support for a candidature for non-permanent membership of the UN Security Council. In the matter of Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity, challenged and threatened by Venezuela as it is. We remain, to quote the Secretary General at the opening of the general debate yesterday, and I quote, committed to make the most of every diplomatic tool for the pacific settlement of dispute as set out in the Charter of the United Nations, end of quote. In this case, judicial settlement as determined by the Secretary General himself. The world's nations can be assured that Guyana shall remain true to those peaceful processes and deny every effort to depart from them. The International Court of Justice has already affirmed its jurisdiction in the matter. Mr. President, Excellencies, this Assembly must reinvigorate the spirit of multilateralism in finding solutions to the extant challenges which bedevil the global community of states. I close by reminding us all of an old quote: a hungry man is an angry man. Global inequality is linked to global security, and global security is linked to the prosperity of all of humanity. I thank you, and God bless you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. We have heard the last speaker in this meeting. The 7th plenary meeting to continue with the general debate will be held immediately following the adjournment of this meeting. This meeting is adjourned. And the 7th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will hear an address by Her Excellency Katalin Novák, President of Hungary. I request protocol to escort Her Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome Her Excellency Katalin Novák, President of Hungary, and invite her to address the Assembly.
It has perhaps always been the case that the waging of peace is the hardest form of leadership of all. I know of no single formula for success, but over the years I have observed that some attributes of leadership are universal and are often about finding ways of encouraging people to combine their efforts, their talents, their insights, their enthusiasm, and their inspiration to work together. A quote from the speech of Her Majesty, the late Elizabeth II, from 2010, delivered here at the United Nations General Assembly. Today, on the International Day of Peace, I stand here to urge the world leaders to be faithful to the legacy of Elizabeth II so that we can live in peace. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm particularly pleased and honored to greet my fellow Hungarian, President Csaba Kőrösi. With his presidency, after 40 years, Hungary is again serving as President of the UN General Assembly for 1 year. It is a great honor for Hungary, and especially so in the present challenging situation. Mr. President, dear Csaba, I wish you every success in your work. I'm standing in front of you today as the President of Hungary, the first woman President of my country, wife and mother of 3 children. As a President and as a mother, I feel responsible for preserving an environment for the generations to come, in which they can enjoy security and comfort. Today, on the International Day of Peace, I stand in front of the General Assembly to reaffirm our commitment to the UN Charter, Article number 1, to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about, by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. Let us remind ourselves to the main aim why the United Nations was brought to life: peace. We, people and leaders in the Western world, often pretend that we have lived in an age of permanent peace and prosperity since the end of the Second World War. In many ways, this might be true. Indeed, we live in a more peaceful and prosperous age than before. Let's not forget, though, that the wars and armed conflicts that rage in many regions of the globe, which kill innocent people, tear apart families, destroy infrastructure and economies, turn well-kept agricultures into wasteland, and add to the destruction of the world that surrounds us. According to the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker, there are currently 27 ongoing conflicts worldwide. The tracker categorizes conflict into 3 groups: worsening, unchanging, and improving. Right now, there is not a single conflict described as improving. Globally, conflict and violence are on the rise, according to the United Nations. The UN has warned that peace is more under threat around the world than it has been since the Second World War. The number of wars and armed conflicts around the world has been rising intensively since then. The scholarly optimism that the decline in the number of casualties might lead to a process where armed conflicts become irrelevant was quickly overshadowed by recent developments in Europe and other parts of the world. Excellencies, I come from Hungary, from the heart of Europe. Everyone would assume that since the Second World War, peace has been a regional characteristic. Let us not forget that only 11 years after the end of the Second World War, Soviet tanks were rolling on the streets of Budapest. We had 45 years of communist dictatorship, and it didn't take long after the peaceful change of regime of 1989 that war broke out in our imminent southern neighborhood. The killing lasted for a decade. Now, after hardly more than 20 years, war is raging on the European continent, once again in Hungary's neighboring country. It fills us with particular concern, especially because ethnic Hungarians living across the borders also shed their blood. Russia's war against Ukraine is a constant threat and security risk, not only for the Ukrainian citizens living in the war zone, but also for all of us. The threat of escalation is a reason for worry and action. Hungary firmly condemns Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which has destroyed peace in Europe, caused dramatic human suffering and destruction, and has serious repercussions on the world order. Since the beginning of this conflict, Hungarians have stood with the victims. We have been providing economic, social, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people fleeing the war. Hungary is currently implementing the largest humanitarian operation in her recent history. The Hungarian people, churches, civil organizations, local authorities, and the government gave shelter to nearly 1 million refugees since the outbreak of the conflict. We have learned that war is evil and leads nowhere. A war only has victims, and the ones with the greatest losses are families, mothers and fathers who lose their children in the battlefield, wives who lose their husbands in the fighting, children who lose their brothers, sisters in the hell of war. It is in the strongest possible terms that we call for the investigation of war crimes committed against innocent civilians. These crimes must be documented, investigated, and prosecuted by the relevant international institutions. No crimes committed can go unpunished. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, what do we want in the UN? To win the war? We should not stand for winning any war. We need to stand for restoring the peace. If there is a will, there is a way. Hungary is a member of several federal systems. Above all, the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, the Council of Europe, and I could go on. These organizations were created by their founding fathers to pursue peace as their fundamental goal. I could say that they were created by the desire for peace, and I'm convinced that the service of peace is the foundation of their identity. Let me recall again the words of late Queen Elizabeth II. I quote, "The aims and values which inspire the United Nations Charter endure to promote international peace, security and justice, to relieve and remove the blight of hunger, poverty and disease, and to protect the rights and liberties of every citizen." Hungary urges fellow member states to declare peace as the major priority in the present conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Excellencies, dear President, ladies and gentlemen, it is by no means self-evident that today, at the time of war, energy and food crisis, the organizations set up to avoid war and preserve peace are focusing on ideological indoctrination. This is not what is needed today. Instead, we must regain our ability to distinguish between the essential and the irrelevant, the important and the unimportant, reality and fiction. Most of us came to the assembly from London. We attended Elizabeth II's funeral together and bowed at her coffin. We bade farewell to an exceptional monarch whose life was steeped in service to peace. We owe it to the people and to her memory to make our decisions in the same spirit. Let me conclude by quoting Winston Churchill from 1953. "Those who can win a war well can rarely make a good peace. And those who could make a good peace would never have won a war. Let us make a good peace." Thank you for listening to me.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of Hungary for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort Her Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Alassane Ouattara, President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Alassane Ouattara, President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Monsieur Sabah.
Mr. Csaba Kőrösi, President of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Excellencies, Heads of State and Governments, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. Mr. President, I would like to, first of all, congratulate you on being brilliantly elected to preside over the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. And I wish you every success as you discharge this lofty mission. I also would like to address my heartfelt congratulations to your predecessor, Mr. Abdallah Shahid, and thank him for his outstanding leadership and the effective management of our deliberations during the previous session. Mr. President, his worthy initiatives in a difficult context marked, in particular, by the COVID-19 pandemic, enabled us to keep hope for a better future. I would like to pay a very warm tribute to Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, and assure him that he has the full support of my country as he continues with his tireless efforts to strengthen the role played by the United Nations in implementing the objectives we had set for ourselves. Secretary General, you have every encouragement from us, in particular, as you implement the relevant proposals contained in your report called Our Common Agenda. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Côte d'Ivoire welcomes the major successes that we have seen in many areas of the United Nations since its inception. And in this framework, my country would like to thank the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the HCR. They declared on the 30th June 2022 the end of the Ivorian refugee status. I take this opportunity to welcome the excellent cooperation we've had between the HCR and my country. Nonetheless, the growing number and the complexity of challenges we're facing in the area of peace and security, democracy, human rights, environmental protection remain sources of concern. And I welcome the relevance of the theme of the current session as it invites us to search for the solutions to the challenges we're facing. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the growing geopolitical tensions and new and emerging international conflicts undermine international peace and security. The war in Ukraine has just recalled for us the fact that peace is a permanent quest and that we have continued pursuing it tirelessly. This confrontation, with the risk that it represents of using nuclear weapons, continues to undermine global peace and to plunge humankind into various crises. It shows us yet once again the limits of military options in the settlement of conflicts. And that is why Côte d'Ivoire has always advocated peaceful coexistence as well as dialogue in the search for solutions to differences amongst nations. And we would like to renew our appeal to the immediate and definitive cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. This war has very serious economic, financial, and social ramifications for African countries. Indeed, the hike in the price of oil and the difficulties in supplying markets with grain and fertilizer have led to a generalized inflation and a spike in the interest rates in international markets, and also resulted in the slowing down of the global rate of growth. Therefore, for several African countries, this conflict means that it's difficult to fund their economies. It also means that there is a growth in the price of basic goods, and even there are cases of famine. And this is because the countries depend on the grain and fertilizer coming from Ukraine and Russia. And this situation led the government of my country, Côte d'Ivoire, to subsidize the price of oil and wheat, and to cap temporarily the price of several major food products, so as to extend support to households, in particular the most vulnerable ones. I welcome the signing in Istanbul on the 22nd of July 2022 under the aegis of the United Nations and Turkey on the wheat agreement. We regret, however, that only 17% of wheat exported by Ukraine since that date have been earmarked for African countries. Now, given this fact, Côte d'Ivoire is asking once again that priority be given to Africa in the implementation of the Istanbul Agreement. Furthermore, we launch an urgent appeal to international financial institutions and to Africa's development partners to mobilize the resources necessary to support the most fragile countries so they can face the multiple ramifications of the conflict in Ukraine. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, peacekeeping operations of the United Nations are a tangible manifestation of our collective action for peace in those countries which are victims of conflict. Côte d'Ivoire hosted one of the largest peacekeeping operations in Africa, and we understand very well the sacrifice made by the troop-contributing countries, the sacrifice they make so as to bring back peace and facilitate post-conflict recovery. It is because of the success of the United Nations operation in Côte d'Ivoire, UNOSI, and because of our faith in the values of the United Nations Charter, that my country decided to actively participate in United Nations peacekeeping operations, as I declared to the Security Council in December 2018. I therefore am very happy with the participation of Côte d'Ivoire in the United Nations multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali, MINUSMA, and in the United Nations mission in the Central African Republic, MINURCA. And I would like to laud the professionalism of the Ivorian contingents deployed in the course of these operations. And I bow in front of the memory of the Ivorian servicemen who died in the cause of peace in the brotherly country of Mali, which needs the engagement and commitment of everyone with them as they combat armed terrorist groups. Unfortunately, in this context of fighting against terrorism, 46 Ivorian soldiers deployed within the 8th national support element detachment within MINUSMA in Mali are unjustly detained there and have been detained since the 10th of July of this year. And once again, I call for their release without delay. My country encourages the Malian authorities to focus their efforts on combating terrorism and on implementing resolutely the various stages of the transition timetable, as well as institutional and political reforms in the run-up to the presidential elections planned for February 2024, and to do this for the well-being of the entire Malian people. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, terrorism continues presenting a major threat to international peace and security, and an enormous challenge that no country can face on its own. And that is why we need to strengthen our collective instruments of combating this scourge and to show our solidarity and determination. In this regard, my country welcomes the decisive action by France and its European partners in the Sahel, and reiterates its appeal for a greater involvement of other major powers in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel and in the Gulf of Guinea, in support of national armies to the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the Accra Initiative, of course. So as to contribute to this collective effort, Côte d'Ivoire puts at the disposal of the African countries its International Academy on Combating Terrorism, which is an institution in the coastal city of Jacquesville, which provides training in all civilian and military skills needed to fight against terrorism. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our session is taking place at the time where the energy crisis following the war in Ukraine tends to undermine the accomplishments we have made in greenhouse gas emission reduction, in particular because of going back in some industrialized countries to using carbon-based fuel. The time, unfortunately, is running out, and we have to act fast and implement all of the commitments contained in the Paris Agreement if we want to implement the objective of stemming the global warming below the threshold level of 1.5 degrees Celsius. To reach this goal, developed countries have to drastically reduce their levels of greenhouse gas emissions and to honor the commitment to mobilize $100 billion per year for the benefit of developing countries. COP27, to take place in Egypt, will provide us, I am certain, with a new opportunity to renew the political commitment of all of the stakeholders to contribute towards the fight against global warming. I would like to state yet once again that my country will honor its commitments undertaken within the Paris Agreement on Climate, and we intend to work to protect our forest cover and our rich biodiversity. This is the rationale behind the Abidjan Legacy Program, which was launched at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Desertification, COP15, which we had the honor of hosting from 9th to the 20th of May of 2022. And I am very happy to see the exceptional mobilization and the financial support from our developing partners to the Abidjan Legacy Program, which very quickly collected the resources needed for its implementation, namely $2.5 billion. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today, more than ever, humankind is at a watershed moment for its future. The threats our countries are facing compel us to show greater solidarity, working together, justice and equity, all principles which undergird the multilateralism which my country holds dear. And it is in this spirit that Côte d'Ivoire calls for an in-depth reform of the United Nations Security Council, where Africa could find its right place. I thank you, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Your Excellency Chaba Korosi, President of the General Assembly, Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me commend the President of the 76th session of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid, for his sustained effort in returning the General Assembly to its pre-pandemic work pace and his message of hope. Let me also extend my congratulations to Your Excellency Mr. Chaba Korosi on your assumption of the presidency of the General Assembly. I'm gratefully optimistic about your leadership in these unprecedented times. I also commend the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for galvanizing the necessary multilateral support in search of solutions to meet the scale and urgency of current global challenges. His timely submission of our Common Agenda report that speaks to strengthening the global governance with a focus on a future agenda driven by multilateral solidarity and collective action is also commendable. As our world wrestles with an unprecedented and volatile economic outlook because of the lingering effects of COVID-19 pandemic and other crises, the theme, watershed moment, transformative solutions to interlocking challenges, is most appropriate and timely. Mr. President, our progress towards achieving global sustainable development goals by 2030 has been complicated by the repurposing of global development and investment finance, disruptions of production and supply chains, growing food and energy insecurities, general slowdowns in the economies of nations, and the perennial adverse effects of climate change. I call on the global family to be intentional and fair about developing innovative development financing products that are free from the stringent restrictions and high transaction costs associated with concessionary loans. Multilateral financial institutions can de-risk investment that are critical for sustainable development. Aid must also be aligned with domestic development priorities. Mr. President, the adverse effects of climate change are borderless. Global warming, unpredictable weather patterns, rising sea levels, and land degradation are taking a profound toll on global food and water security. There are associated governance and stability costs. We are informed that Africa faces disproportionate risk and cost from climate change. We must therefore be consistent in meeting our commitments to all existing international frameworks for addressing climate change. Beyond the usual declarations, we must collaborate on and coordinate mitigation efforts, improve infrastructure for early warning systems, invest more in improving the management of water resources, promote disaster risk management, and enhance the conservation and protection of natural habitats. There are opportunities, especially in Africa, and Sierra Leone in particular, for just energy and just rural agricultural transitions. Fair and accessible multilateral climate financing can catalyze the global and country-specific measures and innovation necessary to build and support sustainable climate resilience. Green investing does support sustainable development. In these efforts, the role and interest of women and young people must be central to climate investments. Sierra Leone is fully committed to concluding the Treaty on Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. The BBNJ Treaty must prioritize, among other things, conservation measures, fair and equitable sharing of monetary and non-monetary benefits, meaningful capacity development, and the transfer of marine technology. Mr. President, human capital development is a critical driver of inclusive and sustainable economic development. Sierra Leone has increased domestic financing for education, provided teaching and learning materials, improved education policies and governance. More children, more girls, including pregnant girls, poor and rural learners, and learners with disability are now in school. But we can go beyond these access deficits. As co-chair of the High-Level Steering Committee on SDG 4 and champion of the Transforming Education Summit during this 77th session of the General Assembly, I urge concerted global efforts to address the learning crisis. We can mobilize innovative financing models, underwrite universal access, especially for girls and learners with disabilities, promote technology in education, make greater investment in foundational literacy and numeracy, address water, sanitation, and hygiene, and other infrastructural deficits, support school feeding programs, fund technical and vocational training, and finance other needs across the full spectrum of the education sector. With close cooperation among states, we are confident that we can address the learning crisis in our time. Mr. President, to address the global food crisis that is disproportionately affecting least developed countries, Sierra Leone joins the urgent call for action to escalate financing to support agriculture and irrigation, enhance food systems and nutrition for vulnerable populations, and social protection for at-risk populations. Sierra Leone also associates with call to ease global supply chains, especially for fertilizer, rice, and other agricultural commodities. Multilateral support for establishing agricultural development banks that will support private agricultural investment and agricultural value chain addition. We promote self-sufficiency and greater resilience in that sector. The COVID-19 pandemic reminds us that equity, multilateral cooperation, and a comprehensive global response are what we need to address health emergencies that have the potential to undermine global peace, security, and global development. Sierra Leone affirms its commitment to global efforts at exploring innovative and effective ways to enhance health security, pandemic preparedness, build capacity to respond to health emergencies, and enhance greater resilience in health care delivery. Sierra Leone believes that multilateral support is urgently needed to complement national efforts at reducing maternal and child mortality, preventing epidemics, tackling tropical and communicable diseases, building healthcare infrastructure and the capacity of healthcare personnel, and strengthening primary healthcare. Efforts at increasing domestic financing of healthcare should be supported with increased multilateral financing and enhanced cooperation. Sierra Leone remains exclusively committed to the global agenda for putting women and girls at the center of inclusive sustainable development. We believe that we cannot deliver on the 2020 Agenda on Sustainable Development without the achievement of great gender equality and women's empowerment. We must therefore garner multilateral support to achieve and sustain gender equality and the empowerment of women in our lifetime. Mr. President, Excellencies, sexual violence is a grave threat to justice and the fundamental rights of men, women, and children throughout the world. In every corner of the globe, sexual assault survivors are inhibited in holding perpetrators accountable and accessing empowering health, legal, and economic remedies. In Sierra Leone, we have taken extensive legislative and administrative actions to address sexual and gender-based violence since my declaration of rape as a national emergency in 2019. Last year, before this August Assembly, I announced that I had directed a permanent mission of Sierra Leone to the United Nations to sponsor a standalone resolution on access to justice for survivors of sexual violence at the General Assembly. I called for global solidarity on this issue and for the United Nations to give all survivors of sexual violence the remedy they deserve. The General Assembly on the 2nd of September this year adopted by consensus the landmark resolution entitled International Cooperation for Access to Justice, Remedies, and Assistance for Survivors of Sexual Violence. Thank you, the National Assembly. The General Assembly has therefore affirmed the sincere and share the belief of the global community that sexual violence is condemnable and that member states must take effective actions